Afternoon. Can you all hear me okay? Great. So before I ramp up and tell you how we dealt with clemency, wrongful convictions, and unjust prosecutions when I was Attorney General in Virginia, I need to sort of get a running start to that to explain to you why basically how we dealt with them was to take the position there were none. There weren't going to be any clemency petitions granted, there weren't going to be any wrongful convictions, and there weren't going to be any unjust prosecutions because we had our man and we were going to do our job in seeing that the death penalty was imposed. So I ran for office in 1987. At the time, the death penalty was not a significant issue in the race, but as a conservative Republican, it was a box I checked off that, yes, I'm in favor of the death penalty. I can't tell you that I really had a strong feeling about it. I just knew that if I was going to run for office, I didn't want to have to deal with being against the death penalty in Virginia. So I ran as supporter of the death penalty, although it wasn't an issue, and served for 10 years in the Senate of Virginia and then for 4 years as Attorney General. During the 10 years I was in the Senate, I was on the Courts of Justice Committee, and I don't think there was a bill that came down the pike that didn't expand the death penalty or do away with or make it easier to uphold a conviction. All of those bills I voted for. They were all sort of in a sterile environment of sitting in the Senate chamber of Virginia with gold tobacco leaves painted on the ceiling. I wasn't at all involved in getting my hands dirty in the process. I was a little bothered by it internally, quite frankly, because on the issue of abortion I was pro-life. And I sort of felt that my colleagues who were pro-life and anti-death penalty made more sense in their overall approach to the issue of the sanctity of life, but it wasn't something I'd spent a whole lot of time on. I got elected Attorney General, and all of a sudden things were different. All of a sudden now I was involved in this methodical, grinding process of executing someone by the state. While I was Attorney General, we had 36 executions in Virginia. That was in 3.5 years. It was almost routine. The way it worked, basically, from a process point, is in Virginia, like most states, any case that came up on appeal, the Attorney General's office handled. So our job was to uphold the conviction throughout the appeals process. We had a capital litigation unit, and they were scary good. That's all they did. And they had done it for years. And they were vastly superior at that time to many of the attorneys who ended up representing capital litigation defendants, many of whom were not trained properly, were not properly funded. So we had a great track record, and in those 36 executions, they all went through, obviously. My staff would gather at the office in the evening of an execution. In Virginia, they don't do executions until late at night, close to midnight. We used to call it the death watch. We were primed and ready to deal with any appeal, last-minute objections, anything from the governor, right up until the end. Well, the first 2 or 3 times I was there, I thought it was important, and then I realized these things are going through every time. And so I sort of stopped coming. I let my staff do it. But to be quite honest with you, part of it was because the whole process was starting to erode me. It's one thing to sit in a chamber of a government building and vote on a death penalty bill. It's another thing to day after day after day be involved in the process of putting someone to death. And I wanted to create and needed to create some distance, which I did. I've come to the conclusion at this point, and I'll skip some of the reasons why, but I no longer support the death penalty. Today I spend a lot of my time talking to quote-unquote conservatives about why it really doesn't make sense for them to support it either. You know, at the bedrock of true conservatism is a skepticism of the ability of government to do things well, like health care, right? Well, why would you want to entrust the government with the power to put someone to death? especially when now we know it's not a system that's free of bias, it's not a system that's free of discrimination, it's not a system that's free of corruption, it's not a system that's free of junk science. And thanks to the Innocent Project, we now know that 156 people have been exonerated. For many, many years in Virginia, the argument was, well, we've never put an innocent person to death. And that was true around the country. Well, we know now, number one, that's not true, and number two, we've come pretty darn close a lot of times. Somewhere in my public education and then in college and law school, it was drilled into me that the bedrock of our criminal justice system is that it's better for 10 guilty people to go free than one innocent man to be put in jail. And certainly that's true of being put to death because it's irreversible. The death penalty, I believe, is based on a false utopian promise. That is, that the system is free of taint, that the death penalty can be applied fairly in all circumstances, and in fact is, and we know now today that's simply not true. You've heard today all politics is local. That was one of Tip O'Neill's great expressions. I would submit to you all politics is personal as well. So when we think about how people's minds are changed about the death penalty, I would suggest to you it's going to probably be a personal experience. I saw this firsthand. After I was Attorney General, I was president of Prison Fellowship, which is one of the nation's largest outreach to prisoners. And for the first time, I spent a lot of time in prison. And, 30 years ago, you could go around and ask people to raise their hand how many of their family members or close friends had been in prison in a lot of communities, and no hands would go up. But today, you can walk into any church, any Rotary Club, any law school, and ask people to raise their hand if they've had a family member or friend in prison, and hands go up all over the place because of the mass incarceration we've had. People's minds have been changed because all of a sudden, oh, it's my sister. That was my boy. That was my nephew. For people who are in public office to change their minds about the death penalty, I think it will have to be because of a personal experience, and that's why I believe telling stories are so critical to changing people's minds. The stories of people who have been wrongly convicted, the stories of some of the corruption, the stories of some of the racism. For me, the tipping point, I sort of stayed on the fence on this issue until about 18 months ago, and the tipping point for me was the George Steny case in South Carolina. I know most of you are familiar with it, but George Steny was an African-American 14-year-old child who was executed in 1944. He was accused of bludgeoning two white girls to death, aged 7 and 11. He was arrested the morning after the murders. He was tried within 30 days. It was a one-day trial. His family was excluded from the courtroom. He had a court-appointed lawyer that had never done a capital litigation case. The jury deliberated, an all-white jury, for 10 minutes, handed down the death penalty, and 60 days later he was electrocuted. And at the time he was electrocuted, he weighed 95 pounds. Well, that was in 1944, right? What it reminded me of, though, the story is that now South Carolina has vacated the judgment against George Steny because of judicial review. I won't go into all that, but it reminded me of how in every generation we have a whole lot of hubris about how today we can get it right. We're better than they were in 1944. But every generation is subject to our own prejudices and discriminatory practices and corruption, and we can't make a mistake in the death penalty. It's either got to be 100% all the time, laying aside the moral considerations for a minute. From a criminal justice standpoint, it's got to be 100% all the time, or it's no good at all. So when I was Attorney General, how did we handle clemency and wrongful convictions? Well, we didn't. we would take the position that it was not a wrongful conviction, and it inbred into every executive branch office at the Attorney General level, in my opinion. I'm not talking about attorney generals, I'm talking about the office. Inbred into the institution of the office is to uphold what was done at the lower court. So when we were asked by the governor what we thought about clemency, we would give him the reasons why he was on solid ground not to grant clemency. If there was a question about wrongful conviction, we gave the governor the reasons he was on solid ground to uphold the conviction. Is that right? Of course not. If I was Attorney General today, knowing what I know now and having come to the conclusions I've come to, alongside the capital litigation unit in the office, I would put a unit that was totally separate and whose only goal was to review cases, both death penalty cases and others, for exactly the kind of things that have led to exonerations, and to give them the freedom to persuade me, just like the capital litigation had the freedom to persuade me why they ought to keep going full bore, and they always did. Give this other group the freedom to persuade me why something ought to be overturned and why the Attorney General, the chief prosecutor of the state, ought to go to bat for undoing something that was done at the local level. And I think you could do that whether you were pro-death penalty as an Attorney General or whether you weren't. And I stay involved in the Attorney Generals Association. I don't know of any Attorney Generals, unless they're in non-death penalty states, who are opposed to the death penalty. The office lends itself to being in favor of the death penalty. So that's a little bit about my story. I'll share a little bit later about Earl Washington, who was the one clemency petition that Governor Gilmore, who was governor when I was Attorney General, did change, and why that happened. Thanks.
Thank you, General Earley.